Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and I want to wish you all a happy new year. This is the first video I'm recording in the new year, so let's hit it off with a bang. If you liked the topic of today's video, or indeed the topic of any of my videos, then you can consider giving via Super Thanks. It's basically like a super chat on YouTube or Twitch, but it goes on a video. And it's very useful for me because, it's a little bit extra dosh, which is always lovely and very appreciated. And it also just tells me what topics you guys are really interested in. So if you want to see more of something, consider giving via Super Thanks. Thank you very much. Right, so today we are kind of finishing off our whole Romulan season by answering this very difficult question. What is a warbird? Now, after covering Romulan history from TOS through that very long lost era for the Romulans, all the way up to TNG, I feel like I am now in a position where I can actually answer this question and give something of a definition, not a concrete, but something approaching a definition. So before we ask what is a warbird, we must first ask, why is warbird? How is warbird? What make warbird happy? Now, the community, I actually put out a community post a while ago now, and there were some interesting definitions that people came out with. Geekius Maximus suggests that it is a large capital ship capable of superior power projection and equal or greater to any enemy vessel in a one-on-one engagement, and is able to wield terror through its size and cloaking device. Torius Dax suggests that it is similar in role to a Star Destroyer. It's less of an actual class and more of a kind of role that a ship takes on. If a Star Destroyer is a giant space Dorito, then a warbird is a giant laser bird. YC Plum suggests that it is just a term for a deep space capable vessel, much like how a warship is a term compared to a corvette. A corvette is something that stays at home and protects home waters, and a warship is something that goes out on the oceans far away from a home base. So it's just a kind of an implication of range. David Eden suggests that it is an old Vulcan term for a nuclear strategic bomber from back during the wars at the time of Awakening. I'm not sure I think that's correct, but it's a very interesting idea. I'd like it to be true, but I don't think it is. Don't Drunkheim Shoot suggests that it is anything between a heavy cruiser and a battleship. It is stealthy and ambush capable, and it has a doctrine based on using the cloaking device to increase survivability, and that's a very good point. Romulan ships are neither particularly tough in terms of their shielding, nor are they particularly maneuverable things, so the cloaking device forms an important part of that defensive onion. George W. suggests that it is capable of surgical, rapid aggression. The only issue I have there is rapid. Warbirds have never been rapid. The Romulans have never been particularly rapid. It's not really their thing. But apart from that, it's still an interesting idea. I think much more in concert, though, with a bird of prey concept. Mr. Lau has a very interesting suggestion, and that was that it was actually the Romulans' way of avoiding a copyright lawsuit from the Klingons, because they kept calling things birds of prey, and the Klingons were like, well, hang on a minute, that's our name, we came up with bird of prey, you can't use that, you've got to pay us royalties. And the Romulans were like, well, no, now we're going to call them all warbirds. So you now can't claim royalties from us. So these are some interesting ideas, and some of these get very close to the definition. But I think in order to fully understand what a warbird is, we actually have to go back in the history of Romulan warships and look at how do we get to a warbird? How do we get there? So I think the thing to do is go all the way back to the 22nd century, to the end of Aquarius, as I've called it. In this age, the Romulan fleet is composed of very aquatic-inspired ships, not very avian, very aquatic, very deep-sea manta rays and squids and jellyfish. These are very, very different to what we'll later see, and it might partially be because at this time the Romulan fleet was much more modelled on a submarine service as compared to perhaps later on where it becomes again more modelled on a strategic bomber force. Now, these ships are basically characterised by a single thing: heavy firepower. These ships carry powerful forced plasma weapons, and they also carry a lot of torpedoes. Well, strictly speaking, nuclear missiles, but nuclear torpedoes, whatever you want to call them, they carry a lot of torpedoes. They carry a lot of ordnance. One-on-one could pretty easily slap aside any United Earth ship. So they like that, they like the superior firepower, and that gets them pretty far in the war, particularly early on, before the United Earth starts to really build up a logistics chain to fight on a level where they can outperform the Romulan ships, even with somewhat inferior technology, although inferior in some areas, superior in others, such as warp drive. But ultimately what lets these ships down is that they lack sufficient mass of numbers. You see, yes, okay, each individual Romulan ship is capable of exerting far more force and military firepower. It's a far greater military asset, but it can only be in one place. Compare that to Daedalus class vessels, which are much cheaper, much easier to build, have a decent level of firepower for their day, nothing wild, but also not bad either. And you can just be places where the Romulans aren't, because the Romulans are busy dealing with the other Daedalus class ships over here. What we have here is a problem of the enemy's numbers and their ability to employ numbers and massive numbers to simply overwhelm your superior force, sometimes without even having to directly engage it. So the conclusion that they have from the Romulan Earth War is that overwhelming firepower, overwhelming force is great, but if you're going to be outnumbered, which the Romulans always will be, they cannot produce at that kind of level, they're just simply not set up for it, then instead your force must be applied more strategically rather than conventionally. The Romulans realise they can't just fight a conventional interstellar conflict of ships going straight at each other because they're going to lose. The enemy is almost always going to have more ships than them. So they must employ their firepower and their force strategically at key points in the enemy's military infrastructure, thereby knocking out their ability to fight the war on the level at which they wish to fight. And they will do this by use of infiltration tactics. This is, of course, where we get to the neoclassical era, where we have things like the Talis, the Thry. The concept is good, but it hasn't yet matured, nor is the technology really there to fully support it. And there are still lessons to learn. You can't just bypass an enemy fleet. They're gonna look for you. The enemy fleet is not just gonna sit there and gawp as you go around destroying all their infrastructure. And again, it partially is tied to the Romulan mindset of, well, you know, our ships are very short range, can't really do too much deep space, so they can basically just do shuttle runs, you know, to a target and back. Their mistake is thinking that their enemy is going to be limited in the same way, which they aren't. But that's just because that's how the United Earth operated back in the 22nd century, and they thought, well, they won't have changed. But that was because of the limits of the technology. Subsequent to the 22nd century, of course, Starfleet has evolved, and it's a little bit harder to carry out the operation exactly in the way the Romulans had planned it, and it probably wouldn't have worked. Fortunately for them, you have the balance of terror, and they never have to put that to the test. But they do realise that, yeah, okay, we can't rely on this cloaking device 100%. We need a little bit more. Our ships need to be a little bit more well-rounded. It can't just be about cloaking devices and firepower. That's not enough. This must then be supported by an ability to blow through enemy defenses where they will counter you, where they will interdict your movements, and also counter the enemy's retaliatory responses. And that, of course, leads us to Anima Avis, the Nova, the Firehawk, Winged Defender, White Wind, Talis Refit, Wings of Vengeance. They still have that emphasis on firepower. These are all very potent vessels of their day. There is a much greater attention placed on the ability to fight in direct ship-to-ship combat. Unlike the Talis and the Thry, which were very much focused on taking out fortifications and the idea that we'll never have to fight ships, they'll never see us. These are ships that are instead built on the assumption that we may well be spotted, but because we're going to be spreading the enemy out so much, and that is actually how the cloaking device counters that problem of the enemy having a greater massive force, the enemy is forced to disperse their forces, say that again, but they are forced to disperse their fleet in anticipation of a cloaked attack. And in so doing, you break it back down to one-on-one engagements or very small-scale engagements because everyone's so dispersed because they don't know where you are, but you know where they are and you know where you can poke through. And you also are confident in the fact that the majority of your ships are one-on-one superior to the enemy ships. The enemy just has more of them, but you've neutralized that factor by forcing them to spread out. It's a little bit different in terms of the counterattack, and that in terms of defending against a counterattack, and their ability to defend against a counterattack is still very limited. It is there, but you are very much relying on the enemy being significantly disrupted by your own strikes, that they are then unable to launch a mass counterattack in an effective way because their infrastructure and logistics and command and control has been so disrupted. That's just ultimately the bet that's relying on. Now, that's effectively in an aggressive confrontational setting, a direct conflict setting. The Romulans realise that this is an incredibly dangerous way to act. And so they realise that actually the best way to carry out this kind of doctrine is to never be at war in the first place. And that, of course, leads us to the rise of the Warbirds. To interdict and frustrate the enemy as he tries to move through his own space by use of long-term deep interdiction. And this is something that is only made capable with the quantum singularity and other advanced technologies that mean that you are able to basically establish a permanent presence in enemy space, or at least a perceived permanent presence. And that is, of course, what we have in the Vamalak, the Danios, and then the first generation of full warbirds in the Didiridex and the Raptor, so on and so forth. Now, all of these requirements are effectively combined in the concept of a warbird. And some warbirds put more emphasis on certain factors over others, but all warbirds are broadly capable of conducting all of these mission profiles on at least one level or another. So, are all warbirds battleships? No. Are all warbirds assault ships? No. Are they all spy ships? No. But they can step into those roles if and when they're needed. Obviously, you can still have dedicated craft, and as I say, some are more specialized towards that role than others. It's not so static. I suppose the way to describe it is ultimately, it's like the Starfleet term Explorer. You know, the Galaxy class, and this is the biggest load of Starfleet innuendo you will ever hear. The Galaxy class is a heavy explorer. Okay, that's what they're calling it. But, you know, we all know what that means. It's a multi-role, heavy platform which, largely through its own size and scale, is capable of pretty much carrying out any mission because it's just so big. It can house the facilities to do pretty much anything, and the Warbird is the same thing. This is why being a Warbird isn't just... They don't just make Warbirds big because they're scary, although of course big things are scary. But they also make Warbirds big because big also allows you to have a greater degree of versatility and capabilities. You look at the earlier sort of birds of prey, particularly during the Anima Avis and the neoclassical era. These are ships that are very specialized. They're all very different and they're very specialized in their roles. They don't really have an ability to act outside it. Again, you go back even then to the age of Aquarius. They are direct naval assets. They are not necessarily capable of that strategic action. A warbird can do all of this. You can employ it in a strategic way or in a tactical way. Whereas you look at something like the Thry. The Thry can only really be applied in a strategic way rather than a tactical way. Compare that to something like the Firehawk. The Firehawk is pretty much completely a tactical asset. It is there to fight other ships. But the Warbird can do both. And that's the key thing. The core of what a Warbird is that it is a multi-role platform which can pretty much carry out any mission that will be required of it. So, are the Thry and Nova Warbirds? Well, no, not really. They're too limited in scope. The Nova comes close. It's obviously its main point of falling down is its limited range. If you slapped a quantum singularity in a Nova and gave it that infinite range, or indeed just gave it a better engine than it had, yeah, you're starting to touch on the concept of a Warbird. The Nova is very much capable of ship-to-ship combat, although it's quite slow and clumsy in many respects, but it is capable of ship-to-ship combat. It's also capable as an assault ship. It's capable of being a strategic strike vessel. All these things, but it's touching the concept, but it's not quite there. So a lot of these ships, you could call them a Warbird, and they do form the lineage that produces a Warbird, but ultimately to call any Romulan vessel prior to 2320 a Warbird is an anachronism. It's something that we will understand, as a history-knowing audience. Oh yes, a Romulan Warbird, that's a big, powerful Romulan ship. But it's not quite, that ain't it. It isn't strictly true, because that word, it may have been uttered in a sort of an informal sense, but it did not become a formal part of Romulan doctrine until the 2320s. That's not to say that it wasn't called that. That's to say that it wasn't written down anywhere. Much like how the German Hetzer tank was never called a Hetzer, but names come out of something somewhere, so somebody must have called it Hetzer. When you talk about a Hetzer, it's a Hetzer, and if you use the term Warbird in a broadly correct fashion, i.e. you're talking about some kind of large, powerful Romulan ship, I think it's acceptable. It's an acceptable historical anachronism, because you're framing it in a way that people will then understand. Oh, a Warbird, big Romulan capital ship. So this then raises the question going into the future. Should all Romulan vessels, or more precisely, should all Romulan capital ships be called Warbirds, like in Star Trek Online? Maybe, maybe not. The Romulans have certainly made a point of calling a lot of their capital grade ships Warbirds. And partially because a lot of the later Warbirds that we see going into the 25th century don't seem to necessarily resemble the Duridex and Raptor and all those other ships that came before. They seem to much more take that sort of, well, a lot of them actually seem to take the battlecruiser line. A lot of them have far more in common with the Raptor concept than the fully fledged Duridex type Warbird concept, where the all singing, all dancing, fully multi-role capable, multi-mission capable Warbird, or Warbird battleship. If you want to subcategorize Warbird, I suppose you could say Warbird battleship, Warbird battlecruiser, Warbird heavy cruiser. Again, that's being very, very pernickety and precise, and ultimately you're going to designate them more on the basis of class at that point. But it does give you a broad idea of how they might factor into a fleet. And Neo-Rexon is a Warbird battlecruiser. A Kurt-chan is a Warbird battleship sort of thing. So the Warbird ultimately as a concept serves as a baseline. I'd be absolutely shocked if these ships of the 25th century weren't somewhat capable of most of these missions, because, you know, it's that thing of technology. You know, okay, these ships in the 25th century, there aren't many of them that are as overwhelmingly massive and powerful as the Diduridex was in the 24th century. The Diduridex was an incredibly potent vessel in its time and completely unprecedented. And you don't necessarily see the same thing in the 25th century. Romulan ships seem to be a little bit smaller and a little bit more pared down in their design. But I would still expect, you know, but with that comes, you know, improved technology, improved miniaturization, and I would be shocked if these Warbirds were not capable of all that I have said as Warbird mission profiles. Basically, to conclude, a Warbird is a ship capable of dominating its closest competition or its primary prey item, seizing or destroying key enemy infrastructure. There's your strategic strike and assault ship all in one, infiltrating enemy space and thereby interdicting their movement within their own space, and to serve as the invisible shield of the Empire. These are the four broad concepts of what a Warbird is. And like I say, I'd be shocked if any ship from the 25th century did not, at least to some extent, satisfy all these criteria because of how technology works. But you can see now how we get to this idea of this is what the Romulans need in their starships in order to satisfy their specific strategic requirements. There we go. That's the definition of a Warbird. I've been talking for a while now, so I will let you go. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And I will now thank my members. My Navarks, David Reeves, Tully DT, and Jeffrey Ballard. My commanders, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Guillermo Martinez, Das Blas, Adam Bowman, and Nathaniel Mead. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, Squadra Course, and Gabe Logan. And I thank all my sub-lieutenants, and welcome Ethan Feldman. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.